можем прямо сказать, НКВД своей разобщительной работой, раскрытием шпионских организаций не только спас много жизней, которым угрожала опасность от врагов, шпионов, диверсантов, разведчиков.
During the long tenure of Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, a turbulent period known as the Great Purge left an indelible mark on the country's history. Between 1936 and 1938, this dark episode was characterized by a brutal campaign of political repression that claimed the lives of millions of Soviets. High-ranking government officials, military personnel, intellectuals, and anyone perceived as a threat to the regime or its leader could be their next victim. A massive number of imprisonments, show trials, and executions were carried out during these years. This widespread oppression spread throughout society, sowing fear and distrust among the citizens. The aftermath would be felt by the Soviet people for decades. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about the Great Purge, the darkest years of Stalin's government. On January 21, 1924, Vladimir Lenin, leader of the Soviet Union since its inception in 1917, passed away. His death left a power vacuum that many important figures within the Communist Party sought to fill. One of them was Joseph Stalin. At that time, his position was not as powerful as others, as he was only the General Secretary. But it gave him a crucial tool: the ability to appoint anyone to any role he desired. Naturally, he used his position to surround himself with loyal and trusted individuals, assigning roles in exchange for favors. By 1929, Stalin had emerged as the clear successor to Lenin, as the undisputed ruler of the great Soviet nation. His major rivals had been expelled from the party or exiled, as was the case with Leon Trotsky. While initially enjoying significant support within the Union, Stalin soon proved to be more authoritarian than expected. Freedoms that Lenin had implemented or promised were curtailed, and the word of the new leader carried far more weight than that of his advisors. Moreover, his plan to transform the Soviet economy from agricultural to industrial had dire consequences. He achieved his goal, establishing millions of heavy industrial factories that modernized the territory, but this came at a chilling cost of lives. The forced collectivization of agriculture proved disastrous in terms of food production, leading to a massive famine in several regions of the country. Its effects were most acutely felt in Kazakhstan and Ukraine, where between 6 and 8 million people are estimated to have died from starvation. This dark period was termed the Holodomor, which literally means death by hunger. Many peasants revolted against the famines caused by these economic measures. The uprisings they led were harshly and bloodily suppressed, with thousands of inhabitants imprisoned or killed.
Esta tragedia es considerada por Kiev y una docena de países como un acto de genocidio del régimen soviético, cuando Stalin obligó a los campesinos a ceder sus tierras y bienes personales a las granjas colectivas. Cualquier campesino que se resistiera era deportado, una medida que desencadenó numerosas revueltas armadas. Para sofocar los disturbios, el régimen soviético decidió en 1932 impedir que los ucranianos recibieran alimentos. Grupos organizados del Partido Comunista saquearon las casas y se llevaron todo lo que era comestible, así como el grano.
And none of this helped Stalin's image, which was plummeting. His failure to fulfill the party's promises, coupled with his authoritarian personality, led many prominent figures to call for his removal from the Soviet government. One man who emerged as a potential next leader was Sergei Kirov. As head of the Communist Party in Leningrad and a personal friend of Stalin's, their relationship had cooled in recent years. According to some accounts, in the 1934 elections that would determine entry into the government's Central Committee, Kirov received only 3 negative votes, while Stalin received 292. However, behind the scenes, the results were adjusted to create a tie, ensuring Stalin's authority would not waver. Nevertheless, the dictator had taken note. In December 1934, Sergei Kirov was shot in the back and killed at his workplace. The shooter was quickly apprehended, and after brutal interrogation, he provided his captors with an extensive list of accomplices. Many of those implicated were Stalin's staunchest rivals and key detractors within the Communist Party. As these men were arrested, several confessed that their plots ultimately aimed at killing the Russian leader. However, the veracity of these testimonies is questioned because many were obtained under torture. Moreover, there are other inconsistencies, such as the fact that the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, left Kirov with only one bodyguard on the day of his assassination. All of this suggests that Stalin may have orchestrated the assassination to justify what would follow. The death of Kirov is considered the precursor to what would become the Great Purge, while those directly involved in his assassination were executed or imprisoned in the weeks following. The actions for which this regime of terror is known began in 1936. It was in this year that the first of what would come to be known as the Moscow trials took place. During these trials, former party members were accused of participating in plots that led to Kirov's death and allegedly aimed to do the same to Stalin. Coincidentally or not, all of them were rivals of the Soviet leader, allied with Trotsky and other powerful figures like Nikolai Bukharin. There was no civilian jury, and the judges found all who appeared before them guilty. Without exception, these individuals eventually confessed to their crimes. However, this occurred after months of imprisonment and interrogations, often involving torture themselves. Beatings, sleep deprivation, and threats to the prisoner's family were just some of the methods used by the NKVD to extract submission. Some only agreed to confess after promises were made to spare their wives and children. Yet in many cases, after the accused were sentenced, Stalin personally ordered their execution. It was evident to many that these trials were a farce, but no one dared to speak out.
Behind the walls of this beautiful building in Moscow, Zinoviev and other Soviet officials are standing their trial for plotting against the life of Stalin. Many more leaders are implicated in the conspiracy. Zinoviev has admitted his guilt. Trotsky is said to have given final instructions against the life of Stalin. The people have demanded the death sentence on Leo Kamenev, a veteran of the Russian Revolution.
The most infamous of these trials took place in 1938. It was promoted as the culmination of all previous trials, where 21 people were accused of being the masterminds behind the conspiracy that killed Kirov. Among them was Nikolai Bukharin, but also other members recently considered staunch allies of Stalin, such as the former head of the NKVD, Genrikh Yagoda. The Great Purge even targeted its own top figures. No one was exempt from being accused. In other cases, trials were not even bothered with. During these years, a high number of government officials died in very suspicious ways. They were always classified as accidental or natural deaths, but NKVD members were often found at the scene around the time of death. Heart attacks were never more common than during this period. However, the Great Purge did not only target current or former Communist Party members. Artists, writers, journalists, professors, and scientists were some of the victims of this massive repression. Anyone who dared to criticize Stalin or his regime could be pursued by the country's secret police, accused of being a spy, saboteur, or simply a parasite of the state. Starting from 1937, members of the Red Army, initially considered apolitical, also became targets. Tens of thousands of officers, from lieutenants to generals, were convicted and executed in just a few years. Charges often included conspiracy with foreign governments, primarily Nazi Germany. It is believed that one of the reasons Stalin purged this institution was his fear of the rising popularity of certain figures who could rival his power. The purge in the armed forces had a disastrous effect, leaving those most servile or loyal to Stalin in positions of authority, rather than the most capable. In the years that followed, the entire Soviet Union would suffer the consequences of these actions. Those who were not shot were sent to the notorious gulags. These prisons existed throughout the Soviet Union, from Europe to the border with China, but the largest were in Siberia. Here, political prisoners and common criminals were forced to do hard labor in inhuman conditions for days that could last up to 16 hours. But even being a relative of those accused was reason enough to be transferred to these camps. Brothers, fathers, wives, even those who were pregnant, and children were also sent to the gulags. The Arctic cold, hunger, and disease killed as many people as the frequent abuses of the guards. In addition, anyone who could be considered a future threat to Stalin could be easily and quietly eliminated in these places. For society, once someone was taken to a gulag, the likelihood of seeing them again was almost nil. Millions of those who entered these places never experienced freedom again.
He came home. He dropped his suitcase and hugged me. And then NKVD's agents knocked on the door. We didn't know what was going on. Later on, we were told that he'd been sentenced to 10 years without mail rights.
Without mail right means execution.
In addition to political repression, the threat of these centers was used to keep the general population frightened. Any minor infraction could be grounds for a one-way trip to a gulag. Being late to work could potentially be deemed, at the whim of the foreman, sabotage against the growth of the Soviet Union. This was how the people, through terror, remained loyal to the Soviet dictator. The purges also targeted members of other parties who, while not significant in the Soviet political landscape, did not share Stalin's ideals. Former members of the Tsarist regime, leaders of peasant rebellions, Orthodox church clergy, and even thieves faced the same fate. Execution, or gulag. It also focused on specific nationalities viewed as inferior to Russians. This was felt most acutely by Polish communities living in the territory, which saw over 100,000 executions. However, there were also thousands of victims of German, Ukrainian, Finnish, Baltic, Bulgarian, Afghan, Iranian, Kazakh, Chinese origin, among many others. Some authors argue that the aim of these mass killings was to prevent these people from conspiring with foreign countries in the event of an invasion. Whatever the motive, whether driven by ethnic or political reasons, These operations resulted in the deaths of nearly 500,000 human beings. But while Stalin gave the orders, it shouldn't be thought that his followers acted with remorse. The NKVD was composed of those who showed blind loyalty or extreme affinity with the policies of the Soviet leader, so they carried out their assignments enthusiastically. As mentioned earlier, Genrikh Yagoda fell from grace and was removed as head of the organization in 1936. He was replaced as commissar by Nikolai Yezhov, who astonishingly turned out to be much more ruthless than his predecessor. He led campaigns against specific nationalities and even began acting without consulting Stalin first. The population of the gulags multiplied immensely during his regime. The years under Yezhov's repression undoubtedly became the most brutal of this terrible process. It's no wonder then that the Great Purge is also known as the Yezhovshchina, or Yezhov period.
And ordinary people found themselves accused wrongly of being disloyal to Stalin's government, and then they faced brutal interrogation and torture. Many also lost their jobs, and some were of course falsely accused, and Yezhov would later say, "There will be some innocent victims in his fight against fascist agents. We are launching a major attack on the enemy. Let there be no resentment if we bump someone with an elbow. Better than 10 innocent people should suffer than one spy get away. When you chop wood, chips fly."
Stalin himself was shocked when he saw reports of the number of deaths that had occurred under his subordinates' orders. He didn't even believe that all those killed were guilty of the crimes they were accused of. Moreover, he resented cases where Yezhov had acted without his permission or on his own initiative. Combined with Stalin's distrust of anyone who could potentially attain a position of power in the future, this meant that Yezhov's dark tenure came to an end. In 1938, the commissar of the NKVD was deposed and arrested. He would be sentenced to death and executed years later, but the moment of his downfall marked the end of the darkest period of the Great Purge. Stalin, now wanting to distance himself from the massive repression, condemned the actions of the NKVD and its chief, lamenting the number of innocent people killed. The reality was likely different. The Soviet leader could already foresee the conflict that would soon take place against Hitler's Germany. He needed to focus on rebuilding the country's military might to face this threat, not on internal affairs. Furthermore, the Great Purge had already achieved its main objectives. Of the 6 original Soviet government members who had come to power after the revolution and were still alive when the purge began, only Stalin remained. 4 of them were executed by the leader's order. The other, Leon Trotsky, was exiled in Mexico but would be assassinated in 1940 by a covert operation of the NKVD. Stalin's position had never been more secure, with his main opponents exiled, imprisoned, or executed. The population lived in constant fear of being reported as enemies of the Union, obediently following orders from the Kremlin in Moscow without complaint. By the time the Great Purge ended, approximately 1.5 million people had died in the Soviet Union. This number only reflects the political executions resulting from the NKVD's persecution. If those who died in the gulags and from starvation are counted, as some authors do, the figures rise to nearly 10 million. But while the period from 1936 to 1938 was the most ruthless, repression continued to a lesser extent until Stalin's death in 1953. Even during World War II, generals accused of cowardice or extreme incompetence were imprisoned and in many cases shot. It was in this conflict where one of the greatest consequences of the Great Purge was seen. As mentioned earlier, a large number of Red Army officers were pursued and eliminated by the NKVD. Many of them were veterans of the Russian Civil War or other subsequent military conflicts, and this experience was lost forever in the gulags or anonymous graves. When the Winter War against Finland broke out in November 1939, everyone thought the Soviet giant would crush its smaller neighbor. But the defenders humiliated Stalin's inexperienced generals, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers died in the snow. When Germany invaded in 1941, the consequences of the repression against their own people were felt even more deeply. After Stalin's death, Nikita Khrushchev assumed leadership of the nation. Immediately, he began to dismantle his predecessor's legacy, labeling him as a bloodthirsty tyrant and denouncing the purges as serious abuses of power. To heal some lingering wounds in the country, he ordered the release of political prisoners who were still held in the gulags. This marked the beginning of de-Stalinization, which granted the Soviet people many freedoms that the previous dictator had suppressed. The NKVD, renamed simply as the Ministry of Internal Affairs, underwent its own purge. The most ruthless members of the organization who had survived World War II met the same fate as many of their victims. Nevertheless, nothing could be done for the countless families destroyed by the Great Purge. Millions of innocent people had been shot for non-existent charges, and millions more perished in the inhumane gulags. Stalin's measures caused a significant portion of the population to never regain trust in the government, and many began to see Western capitalism as a preferable alternative. Many authors assert that the events leading to the dissolution of the Soviet Union began in these years, with the government's attacks on its own citizens. As we reach the end of the video, we'd like to ask you, do you think Stalin would have been overthrown without the Great Purge? Please leave your answer in the comments section, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that have left their mark on history.